The inn pulsed with the energy of the gentry, but in the back a sombre silence reigned. The scent of ale and spices danced in the air, but to me it was merely a veil over the raw reality. Around me, laughter echoed like taunts, but I wasn't there to lose myself in superficiality. I was just a serving girl, moving between tables, but my gaze always fell upon him, the blind prince. Every light has its cost. The weight of that scorn was almost palpable. He sat isolated in a corner, a shadow amidst the lights. People ignored him as if he were a ghost, a stain on the court's tapestry. As I served the nobles, their cutting words reverberated in my ears. The way they looked at him, as if his blindness were a curse to be hidden, infuriated me. It was as if he had no right to exist. With each plate I brought to his table, I felt the indifference dripping from the eyes of others. The boy who should have been given light was plunged into darkness, and there, in his empty gaze, was a yearning for a connection the world refused to offer. In his solitude, he sought some echo of affection or understanding. That's what I saw. That's what stirred my heart. I tried to convey that connection with a simple gesture, placing a plate before him with almost reverent care, as if trying to touch an old wound without hurting him further. He turned his head slightly, and I felt an invisible thread between us. The warmth of his presence could awaken dormant feelings I also knew. It wasn't just compassion I felt. It was an unshakable determination. I knew he needed more than pity. He needed hope. We needed to unearth what lay beyond what they could see. The nobles chatted amongst themselves, but their conversation was hollow. I overheard their cold exchanges, their praises for the beauty of those parading by, and the way they scorned the prince, as if he were a burden meant to be forgotten. My spirit burned, and within me bloomed questions that rejected the answers the world offered. What would someone of such pure lineage do, sitting on the margins of life, if his purpose wasn't to be remembered? On that fateful day, I understood something had to be done. I looked deeper into the darkness in his eyes, where his dreams had been lost. He could rise and become a light of his own. This idea echoed in my mind, a promise forming in the shadows. I was willing to be the bridge between us. The connection we yearned for could materialize in unspoken words, and in that moment I felt I was about to embark on a journey that would change not just the prince, but the entire court. Every light has its cost, and it was a price I was ready to pay. My memories were a dark labyrinth of sadness and resilience. I grew up in a world that had no room for compassion, where cruelty disguised itself as normalcy in daily interactions. Each day, my childhood was filled with cruel whispers, words dragging like shadows. When smiles were mirrors of contempt, I learned to build walls around my heart. I remember the long nights when hope seemed a rare luxury. Food wasn't guaranteed, and the people who crossed my path often became indifferent echoes of a past I longed to forget. And within that darkness, I bought into the idea that my worth was tied only to my ability to go unnoticed, to adapt and serve those who held the authority to decide right from wrong. The blind prince, sitting in the corner of the inn, stirred in me a distant echo of my own story. The solitude he carried seemed an extension of my own. I knew what it was like to fight against a world that only recognized what it could see, and what was more painful. He hadn't been born for this. During a lull between orders, amidst the empty laughter and superficial chatter, I looked at him again. His expressionless face sought kinship, but found only disdain. Finally, in a moment alone, I found the courage to touch his hand. The warmth of his skin beneath my fingers brought to the surface something I had long buried, a desire for connection. He flinched, a reflex of surprise, but also a glimmer of hope. Our souls danced in a silent space, while the voices of the inn became a distant hum. "Knowledge is the first light we can ignite," I whispered. uttering words that were not just promises but a burning conviction. He looked at me with a flicker of curiosity, and in that instant I decided it didn't matter the price we would have to pay. No matter how much the court tried to steal his essence, there was a capacity within him they could not extinguish. I promised I would teach him to read with his fingers, to see in a different way that didn't rely on his eyes. And so the idea was born like a gentle flame, flickering in our hearts. Every light has its cost. We had become accomplices in a silent plan. We knew that by revealing what the court so feared, we were challenging an established order. But the need for liberation outweighed the fears that weighed upon us. There was something more at stake, not just his abilities or our bond. It was an act of resistance against a world that refused to accept him. Time passed in a whirlwind of stolen moments, days marked by smiles in the shadows of a mutual dream. The nobles continued their lives and their intrigues, but we, on the other hand, were building a bridge between what was and what could be. It was time to transform knowledge into power, a power that could open doors and illuminate the court's darkness. I felt determination grow within me, like a storm forming on the horizon before culminating in a gale. There was no turning back, but what we were about to begin could change everything. Dawn was approaching, and with it, the promise of truth's rescue. I was willing to face the shadows that would come, for I knew that together we were stronger than any oppression could imagine. The inn had become our sacred refuge, where the weight of the world seemed to dissolve into distant laughter and conversations. Each night there we were, together as the court's shadows surrounded us. The prince, in his solitude, discovered new letters under my fingers, and a glimmer of hope began to shine in his eyes. With each lesson, I learned more about what lay hidden beneath the surface of his life. "Every light has its cost," I once murmured as he traced the Braille letters with growing curiosity. It was the truth behind the palace walls, and they were beginning to crumble under the weight of our discoveries. I began to see in him something more than a blind prince. He was becoming the spark of a silent revolution. Our lessons transformed into secret rituals. The tension in the conversations of the nobles watching us kept adrenaline pulsing in my veins. The realm we had was forbidden, but we had to stand firm, even as the shadows drew near. The court was watchful, seeking any sign of weakness in the bonds we were forming. And as our encounters intensified, the darkness outside became more palpable. The prince was changing. His questions and his desire for knowledge were becoming a barricade against the court's disdain. A new strength was born from him, one I yearned for in my own soul. With each letter he learned, a new door opened to a more enlightened world. And with that, the idea of confronting the court's oppression became a stronger echo in my heart. However, reality weighed on my mind. There was something in the air. A treacherous plot among the nobles was brewing, and a fear settled in my chest. With time, I questioned if it would be enough to prepare the prince to stand before a cunning enemy. The court would not fail to protect its power, and if we were caught, their fury could annihilate everything we tried to build. And so, I realized I needed a more solid plan. Looking at the prince in his studies, I understood that he couldn't just be a student, but a leader. "You are not just a blind prince. You are the light that will outshine the court's darkness," I declared in a whisper, determination sparking between us. "We need to be cunning. We must strike when they least expect it." Each day the storm gathered in my spirit, and there was no turning back. What we had begun would become a battle we needed to support with more than words. The dawn of our destinies approached, and as we walked together in the gloom, we knew that united we could confront that abyss and, perhaps, transform it into hope. The nights grew heavier, and each day brought the invisible weight of our actions. The tension in the air was palpable, as if the inn's walls also had ears. I couldn't afford to be distracted. The court remained on the lookout for any sign indicating a shift in the power structure, and the prince, even now stronger, was still an easy target for the nobles' claws. I decided it was time to intensify our preparations. What if we knew more about them than they knew about us? I suggested to the prince, sketching plans on a worn piece of paper. He inclined his head, allowing the idea to germinate. We needed to understand the intrigues that permeated the palace corridors, and for that, information would be our most powerful ally. Thus, we devised a strategy. From our furtive conversations, we decided that a spy could be the ideal solution. With the silent words of a code I had created in our lessons, I would pass messages to a reliable source among the palace servants. The security of these lower ranks was our protection, but the danger was palpable. If we were discovered, the consequences would be brutal. The days dragged on, but the anticipation of our plan began to materialize. Information began to flow slowly, fragments of a larger conspiracy in which the court was entangled. A plan of treason against the king himself began to emerge, a faction linked to nobles willing to destabilize the throne in pursuit of power. This revelation awakened in me a mixture of relief and terror, because it meant we were on the right track, but the consequences could be disastrous. With each piece of information, I felt more connected to the prince. What was once a bond limited by compassion now became an intricate pact of trust and determination. He absorbed everything, and even in his blindness, strength emanated from him, like a light in the darkness. But the shadows were always lurking. One night, leaving the inn, I noticed a figure watching me from across the street. My heart pounded. Cloaked in shadow, the stranger was wrapped in a dark cloak, and his intentions were as murky as his appearance. Adrenaline surged, and the need to protect my secrets made me move quickly. I ran for the safety of the inn, but the tremor in my body didn't dissipate. The prince awaited, his expression illuminated by the lamplight. The chasm separating us from the court wasn't just a matter of power. It was a race against time and against those who opposed us. "They're becoming more vigilant," I reported, my eyes wide. "We need to act more carefully, but also more boldly. What are we, if not daring?" The prince nodded, determination etched on his face, and in the silence we made a new promise. We wouldn't let fear paralyze us. The progress, though small, was a sign that the silent revolution still pulsed within us. That night not only brought a new sense of danger, but also renewed our commitment to the truth. Moving among the shadows, we knew we were more than mere pawns on a board of intrigue. It was time to turn our knowledge into action, to start digging our own trenches in the battle to come. It was only the beginning, but in our hearts the flame of revolution burned stronger. The following weeks unfolded like a veil of mist, shrouded in increasing uncertainty. The court had become a minefield, and tension hung heavy around us. With each new piece of information we obtained, the hidden plots of the conspiracy were exposed, but they also revealed a new level of danger. We knew we weren't the only ones seeking power. The rivalry among the nobles was growing, and factions became more fervent. One night, we gathered everything we had learned in a clandestine meeting at the inn, far from prying eyes. The prince was determined to devise a plan. "We need to expose the betrayals before they turn against us," he stated, and his voice carried a determination that resonated in my bones. I could see the spark of a leader blossoming within him, and this filled me with hope. However, the responsibility weighed heavily on our shoulders. The plan we outlined was audacious and risky. By improving communication with our secret allies, we decided that a royal procession would be the perfect moment to expose the conspiracy. The rumors of betrayal needed to be brought to the surface, and it was time to turn our accumulated knowledge into action. This revelation could be our salvation or our ruin, but not without its complications. As soon as we left the inn, A biting chill enveloped the air around us, and the mist seemed to be lurking as if fate itself were watching. A subtle sign, an unusual breeze alerted me to the danger. Someone was nearby, curious, attentive to the actions we were taking. Looking back, I again saw the cloaked figure, watching from afar. The feeling of being hunted made my stomach churn. "We're being watched," I murmured to the prince. His face hardened, but there was a renewed determination in the gleam of his eyes. "We cannot hesitate. Let's act, and let the truth come to life." With a plan in mind, we began to operate under the light of each new moon, gathering allies and charting the architecture of our resistance. Whispered words began to spread through the communities throughout the kingdom. The nobles, at their lavish feasts, didn't realize that in the heart of the people, a flame was about to ignite. Every message that circulated was a step toward our goal. On the night of the procession, everything was in place. Nobles gathered in luxurious attire, laughing and celebrating, while we, camouflaged among the crowd, awaited the right moment. The prince, at the center of the action, was the signal we awaited. He was no longer a distant shadow. Now he was the light that would cut through the court's obscurity. And then, at the height of the festivities, a messenger from one of the conspiring nobles was identified, his boastful speech echoing among the guests. It was the opportunity we had been waiting for. As the prince rose, his heart pulsed with the intensity of the truth that now had to be revealed. The courage he had so cultivated now bloomed in his voice, echoing through the halls like thunder about to break the silence. "Today, the shadows will not triumph," he roared, interrupting conversations with a strike of determination. Absolute silence fell upon the room as the nobles turned to him. The atmosphere was electric, and I knew that in that critical moment the fate of the court was about to be written. It was a turning point, a pulsating climax. Little did we know that the revelation that followed would not only shape our struggle, but unleash an avalanche of consequences that would echo throughout the kingdom. The silence in the hall was oppressive. All eyes turned to the prince, who, in his courage, had risen like a beacon of hope. "The nobles who conspire against the crown not only aim for the throne, but for the destruction of our kingdom," he declared, his voice echoing like thunder. The words seemed to reverberate off the walls, creating a wave of uncertainty among the nobles, who exchanged glances, seeking answers amidst the unfolding chaos. "The time has come for the truth to be exposed. The allies of treason present here must answer for their actions," he continued. This bravery sent adrenaline coursing through my veins, and I knew the moment was decisive. One of the nobles, offended and full of contempt, rose. "A powerless blind prince cannot intimidate us." His audacity seemed a blow to the rising resistance, but the air was shifting and the prince did not yield. "Blind, perhaps, but not ignorant. I see beyond the lies that surround this palace." Moment by moment, the energy shifted. A growing murmur of support arose among those willing to listen. The atmosphere was feeding on words that were once cautiously whispered. In the heat of the confrontation, I realized that truth was beginning to conquer fear. I then stepped forward. "Not only do the prince's words speak, here is proof of their betrayals." I held up a scroll, documenting secret alliances among nobles, the foundations of an elaborate conspiracy. The revelation caused an uproar. Cries of accusation and defense mingled in a cacophony of terror and dread. As accusations flew, the hall became a stage of verbal warfare. The nobles tried to hold their ground, but the strength of the evidence and the prince's courage began to dismantle the facade of oppression. At the climax of the tumult, a servant at the back of the hall, alerted by the commotion, drew a gleaming dagger in the lamplight. "Protect the prince!" I cried, a chill running down my spine as events unfolded in a whirlwind. Tension exploded into action, with allies drawing near, ready to protect the light that was beginning to ignite before the darkness. In this moment of great danger, I realized that the battle was not singular. It was a fight for the very essence of the kingdom. The future was in our hands, and the courage of each of us would be tested in an explosive climax. With destiny intertwining, the fight against betrayal had become not just a necessity, but a call to action that would unite us. The true test was just beginning. The hall transformed into a battlefield, where words became weapons and palpable tension filled the air. The prince, upright and determined, had become the pulsating heart of the revolution. Amidst the confusion, his eyes, which were usually a deep void, now shone with an illuminating clarity. He was not just a leader, he was the embodiment of our struggle. "Advance!" I shouted, my voice cutting through the cacophony. With his allies by my side, we formed a barrier around the prince, protecting him from the shadows that threatened to consume the hall. The servant, armed with the dagger, hesitated for a moment, caught in the confusion, but determination formed in his gaze. He prepared to strike. With a swift movement, one of the nobles, now fearful and numb from the truth, pushed forward, gesticulating frantically. "The truth will set us free, but not in the way you think," he exclaimed, and with that a wave of apprehension swept through the hall. The alliances forming in the darkness had a price, and they were willing to pay it in blood. "Whatever the cost, it's worth more than living a lie," the prince countered, his voice like a roar. "Today, the power of darkness will not prevail." Carlindo, the servant, finally found his courage. He advanced, the gleaming blade reflecting the lamplight, and I braced myself for impact. But then, a resounding cry from the prince echoed like a warning. "A single strike of truth can fell even the closest of traitors." His cries resonated, and in a flash, instead of attacking, the servant hesitated, his blade clattering to the floor. I had a split second to act, so I lunged forward, grabbing his trembling wrist. "You too are captive in this power game. Choose now. Remain in the darkness, or join us in the fight for light." Carlindo's terrified gaze failed to communicate the gratitude he felt, but in his eyes the change was evident. "You're right. We have to change this together." His voice was almost a whisper, but it carried the weight of transformation. He stepped away from his threatening stance. The prince looked around. "Is that what we are, then? A unit in formation? True strength lies in us, not in centuries of oppression." With the loss of the shadow's blessing, a wave of uprising swept through the hall. Nobles began to question themselves, and the truth, like a strong wind, spread in various directions. They discovered that their identities were not forged by alliances and betrayals, but by the choices they would make next. In that moment of euphoria and uncertainty, declarations were made. Allies rose, hearts connected by a common purpose. "Let the practice of lies end here and now," I cried. "May this night be remembered as the moment truth triumphed over wrath and fear." Voices rose, and in a renewing clamor, everyone united. The shadows that once dominated the court now lost their grip, and the newborn resistance began a new era, not just for the kingdom, but for all those who would one day live under the light of truth. The consequences of the battle would unfold, but in that instant we knew we had begun a new chapter in the fight for freedom and justice. And so, as if the world was finally changing, I took a deep breath, the pressure dissipating. The future was still shrouded in mystery, but a thread of hope, rigid and firm, had been woven through those who dared to believe. In that tumult, change crystallized in the air, voices united in a hymn of resistance, echoing through the palace corridors like a storm about to unleash its fury. The wail of oppression began to dissipate, slowly transforming into songs of freedom. There was an electricity in the hall, a hum of promises and new beginnings, but doubt still lingered. The siege wasn't over. The true battle was just beginning. Carlindo was now by our side, but the look that met mine also spoke of risks. "What if the shadows tried to resist?" he whispered, fear visible in his expression. The prince, noticing the hesitation, placed a hand on his shoulder. "Freedom doesn't come without a fight. We need to be more than a voice. We must be the storm that will wash the court clean of its lies." The nobles who once saw themselves as unshakable now displayed signs of wavering. Those who rose to our side were no longer just witnesses, but became protagonists of their own story. The unbreakable barrier that separated the oppressed from the oppressors began to fade. But what awaited us? What dangers still lurked in the shadows, clinging to their old ways? "We need to act fast," I said, my heart quickening amidst the tumult. Tonight's revelation might be enough to galvanize other nations in our favor, but it could also incite the fury of the conspirators. We need to ensure the prince's safety and the protection of those who have joined us. The people around us raised their voices, proposing plans, forming alliances, and creating protection brigades. Nobles, who once viewed their peers as mere tools, were now willing to sacrifice everything for a more just future. We moved forward, not just as allies, but as a true army of daring voices. With a unanimous decision, we organized a strategy. We would be like shadows moving under the moonlight, infiltrating the homes of those who dared to follow the dictates of corrupted power. Our goal: to dismantle the treacherous webs of old alliances and at the same time preserve the new bonds formed in the resistance. As we planned, a group of undecided nobles began to rise against us. There must be limits to revolution. What's at stake is the order of the kingdom. An anxious cry echoed from the crowd. Their faces became a mosaic of fear and contempt, but also of confusion. "What kind of freedom is this that is built on chaos?" inquired an especially imposing man, his gaze firm and calculated. "A freedom that tolerates no oppression," declared the prince. "True order cannot exist without truth. A court that feeds on lies is not worthy of being called home." In that moment, a respectful silence fell upon the hall. The prince's words echoed, creating a pulsating tremor in the rhythm of the hearts around us. He was no longer just a blind prince. He was a vision of a new tomorrow. Our plan of action solidified. The revelations made that night created a domino effect, moving the hearts and minds of many who, until that point, had hesitated. The battle was not just for a kingdom, it was for a shared ideal, and hope, now a living force, was destined to flourish. What once seemed a distant dream now approached face to face, and I knew that whatever the future held, we were ready to face it together.